Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final Politics in a Pub for 2019. I'm Ken Pattermore. I'm part of the organising committee that puts on these events. I want to acknowledge that we're gathered on the land of the traditional owners of the Turrbal and the Yagara people. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. The New Farm Neighbourhood Centre, with the support of Communify Queensland, hosts Politics in the Pub, and each event addresses contemporary issues that are important to the community of Brisbane. So far in 2019, we have talked about loneliness, masculinity, and we've held the federal election Brisbane candidates debate. Every Politics in a Pub is planned by a team of volunteers, and panel members join on a voluntary basis, for which we're very thankful. We seek out diverse voices and perspectives for these conversations, and we can assure you that our invitation list is long and broad and inclusive. And we're so grateful that Karen, Peter, Jono and Graeme can join us tonight. In 2020, we have a stretch goal. We are very excited to announce that in February 2020, as part of the Brisbane Comedy Festival here at the Powerhouse, we're going to be attempting to prove that political comedy is not dead in Australia. With Politics in the Pub, the comedy special. So keep an eye out for that one. We'll be live streaming tonight via that beacon of free speech, Facebook. And one of our team will be on the other free speech platform tweeting during the discussion. So if you'd like to tweet along, you can do so with hashtag Pip I'll get this right, yeah, Pip New Farm. You can exercise your free speech in a number of ways after the panel discussion. You can ask a question, but be aware that Rebecca has done the Tony Jones I'll take that as a comment course. Otherwise, the other way to debrief is at the bar, at Bar Alto out the back afterwards, and you can be, by all means join us. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the generosity and thank those who make this event possible. Brisbane Powerhouse for hosting us. Financial support is received from the patrons of New Farm and the Village News. Patrons is a group of locals who financially support our community's most vulnerable. The patrons convener, Jen Egan, is here, and Michael Hawke, I don't know, he usually hides up the back, but from the Village News is around. But the Village News is the must-read local paper, and the November edition is, as they say, out now. The panellists who give freely of their time and their deep insight, my fellow Politics in a Pub committee members, and finally, Rebecca, who has emceed each of our events this year, and we're very grateful for her contribution and assistance.
Thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Everyone survived whatever you had for lunch today? You didn't do? Don't worry about today's lunch. I want to tell you about my lunch yesterday. Yesterday, I had lunch with my boss, Ita Buttrose. Now, if you did a right to information search, you might actually find that I wasn't alone in that lunch. It was me and 1,000 other people at a lunch where Ita was the guest speaker and I was just jammed up the back on a media table. But I'm just checking that our positions haven't been reversed tonight and Ita hasn't snuck in to see us. So if you see Ita up the back there, let me know, because she might be keen to see these people on stage tonight, because she's very interested in this. And in fact, the chair of the ABC said several things yesterday at this lunch that are relevant tonight. And I might just kick off by quoting some of the things that Ita Buttrose said. And we want this to be a dynamic conversation tonight, so I'm going to get a little bit of audience interaction straight up. I just want you to respond in whichever way you feel comfortable. You can snort, you can jeer, you can smile, you can clap, agree, disagree with just a couple of statements from my boss, the chair of the ABC, Ita Buttrose. One of the things she said is, "Journalists have always been keepers of secrets. We can be trusted." This right to know protest from the media is not going to go away. Oh, a bit of a slow clap. She was asked, how do you find truth in a sea of information? Ita Buttrose said, watch the ABC. Well, that's not too bad. That's all right. Someone said, how do you support the Right to Know campaign? Ita said, write a letter to the government. All right, we might have to G you up as we get along tonight. As you get to know the four freedom fighters in their own right on the couch tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we'll look at journalistic freedom, the Right to Know campaign, public activism, legal consequences, private opinions, workplace consequences. Let me introduce you to Peter Greste, a professor, journalist, author, one of the founding members of the Alliance for Journalists' Freedom and the UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland. But ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, he is a son, and I'm thrilled to see your parents here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Greste. And the last time I saw your parents was not long after you touched down on Australian territory, having been incarcerated in Egypt. My first question to you tonight is, when have you most appreciated your freedom to speak?
Gosh, what a great question. I appreciated that, I think, when I smuggled out some letters from prison. The point at which the Egyptians really wanted to silence us more than anything. The whole point of sticking us in prison was to send a very clear message to journalists all over Egypt, whether now locals or foreigners, that you will not speak to the opposition. That was the Muslim Brotherhood at the time. And we wrestled with why we were in prison for a long time, because the gap between the journalism that we had been doing, which by my own admission, frankly, was pretty mundane, it was pretty ordinary, and the very serious terrorism charges that we were facing was so broad that I couldn't really see how anybody could look at what we had been doing and come to the conclusion that we'd somehow been engaged in acts of terrorism or promoting terrorist ideology. And it was really when I finally, the penny dropped and I realised it actually wasn't about anything that we had done, but about what we'd come to represent. And that was the point at which I was speaking to some of my prison cellmates. You know, as is typical in these kinds of environments, they bring a lot of really smart, lively, energetic, courageous people together in one university, if you like, of reprobates and dissidents. Ideas start to flow around, and one of my colleagues, one of my co-cellmates said to me, "Look, there is nothing quite so powerful as a letter from behind bars, and we can help you get it out." And so I wrote those letters declaring this to be an assault on press freedom rather than an assault on anything we had done. And those letters really seemed to energise the campaign around our campaign to get out of Egypt. And that was the point at which I think both felt most restricted but also most appreciative of the freedom of speech.
I got chills. Jonathan Shree is here tonight. He is the Greens councillor for the Gabba. Jono, does the media always tell the truth about you?
I wouldn't consider the Courier Mail media, so maybe maybe the media does, but I don't know if the media does. I think what I've been really interested in terms of, like, I'm still new to politics, but seeing the way the media operates is that often journalists are just too time poor to check facts. They're under really strong pressure to churn out stories. And sometimes their editors are lazy, and sometimes they're just jerks who are seeking clickbait headlines, and so they will beat stories up and take things out of proportion. So, yeah, it's a mixed bag. I think the journalists who you get to know, you build a sense of trust with and feel like they'll treat you fairly, but you never know how their editors and sub-editors are going to twist a story.
So journalists can be jerks too.
Yeah,
thanks, John.
Everyone can be a jerk.
That's
right?
the headline from tonight. Professor Graeme Orr is here tonight as well, from the University of Queensland, a law professor. He's written The Law of Politics. My question for you, Graeme Orr, is there free speech in politics in Australia?
Sometimes I think there's too much speech, and we're sort of flooded with too much, especially in the days where, you know, Trumpian excess is everything you want. And so we saw the Prime Minister just on the weekend flying a kite about trying to potentially bring in new laws to get environmental boycotts and activists. And I don't think he's even going to come up with these proposals. They're probably not constitutional if he does, but what he's trying to do is frame a debate and get on the attack first. And you see it happening from the President and the Prime Minister down to social media. So you can't have too much of a good thing. Free speech is a good thing, but we've also got to think, I guess, about what it means to speak the truth, preferably, to speak sincerely, and to speak with manner and respect for other people.
Nice. And rounding out the panel tonight, Karen Coghill, who has privileged us by making her way in from Deebing Creek this afternoon, where she's been a protest organiser. Karen, can you speak truth to power in Australia?
You can try. I think one of the biggest hurdles that a lot of people do have generally is the system always will use the democratic system, and it's always the affluent that have the voice more than the disadvantaged. It's easy to just pay a group of people to challenge what you want to put across than to have people motivated by the spirit of love and hope. There's not very many of them left. And that's what the greatest challenge is disadvantage and not being able to have a voice, not even a legal voice, a political voice. We don't have one political party here that has First Nations as a policy. And yet we're ignored and overseen and invalidated a lot in a lot of matters. And then we climb the ladder to get a degree, get in academia, continue with climbing the academic ladder, to get a voice just in the parliamentary cabinet. And still your voice is still invalidated and utilised only. It's constricted because you've got a system at work here that's totally conflicting with the First Peoples systems.
Jono, do you agree? Does money buy you freedom of speech in this country?
Yeah, I think it does, and I think it's important. What Karen was touching on there is that idea of access, because we might all theoretically have the right or the freedom of speech, but if you don't have time to attend a public meeting and speak out, or if you don't have time to write a long opinion piece, the fact that legally you might technically be allowed to speak your truth is kind of irrelevant because you're so busy trying to pay the rent or trying to get from one job interview to the next. And that disadvantage is exacerbated when we see that some interests in society have such big platforms and have the money to spread their views and messages further, while most of us simply don't. And I think a classic example, you look at, say, big industries like the banks or the mining industry, etc. They have a lot of money to push their agenda and push their narratives and push their speech, while conflicting views or contrary views don't have that same resource back in to spread their ideas.
Could I just... One of the issues we have too is the Recognise campaign, heavily funded by mining companies. Where is the democratic process? There's no for and against. $90 million or $70 million the last campaign. A handful of struggling mothers, single mums, lobbied, and with the little we had to boost posts, get on Twitter, ring one another, encourage, try and get just money for paints and banners and try to protest outside of these gathering places where they're pushing the Recognise campaign. We've never been properly consulted. We've never had a voice. We've got government developing statutory bodies called things like Queensland South Native Title Services that manages our native title, which is absolute, it's just a joke. It's such a farce. These are because we are sitting underneath a government that claims to be trustees of the First People, where we have no voice. That gives them, because they are our trustees, that gives them the power to develop statutory bodies that are totally culturally inappropriate, that are only that don't meet the needs of the real grassroots people. We have injustice through the roof. We have 700 murders under institutional abuse in the deaths in custody. Not one arrest. Not one person even has been fired. In fact, we've had people get promoted in the police force on account of one person dying. So, this is the kind of voice we have, where we don't have a voice. And I'm very active in my country here and have led a lot of protests and been involved with a lot of marches for our people. I don't have a voice.
Graeme, or does this point to problems with the political system itself? Is it about systemic change that gives volume to more voices or to all voices? And are we actually trying to address that?
Well, you're asking a law guy, so probably asking the wrong guy. But it's funny, we've moved quickly from the idea of free speech, which is a very old liberal idea, small L liberal, quickly to the structural problems and issues of voice and how you might be able to fix politics. And there's an ongoing question, about whether the government will even respond to the Uluru Makarrata statement to allow a voice assembly to governments for Indigenous peoples. But I'd be happy to talk about some of the legal aspects later.
Yeah, well, okay, then from a legal perspective, can you create laws that elevate voices?
Clearly you can. I mean, a whole lot of things, the government, even in Queensland now, has got around to the idea of restricting political donations and campaign expenses, all the way through to the sorts of things we were just talking about having a nationwide Indigenous assembly. Yeah, there are things you can do to try and improve or nudge the system, but then politics is politics. It's not something that can be rigorously designed and planned for.
Peter Greste, you've spent time around the world in different countries. Do you think Australians don't appreciate enough the free speech that we do have?
Gosh, I don't think we appreciate it enough, but I also don't think we appreciate how restricted it is here in Australia. One of the things that people often are quite surprised to hear is that we have no constitutional recognition or protection for freedom of speech or freedom of the press. All we have, and we are, by the way, I think one of the few, if not the only, and Graeme, you might correct me on this, the only country, democracy, Western democracy, that doesn't have that hardwired into our legal code. The most we have is an implied right of political communication that emerged from a case in 1992 involving the ABC. The High Court basically said, well, our Constitution says that we have a system of representative democracy, and you cannot therefore have a system of representative democracy without the capacity to have political communication. So we've inferred that our Constitution guarantees it. But without any kind of very explicit protections for freedom of speech or for press freedom, what we've got is a system that actually allows our legislators to pass all sorts of laws that either directly or indirectly intrude on freedom of speech. And so, in fact, in Australia, we are, I think, far more restricted in our freedom of speech than almost any other democracy. And I think we've managed to have the free speech that we've got largely because our small liberal traditions are as strong as they are. But at the same time, we don't really appreciate just how legally restricted we are.
I was just going to say, I don't think we've ever had free speech for the most marginalised members of society. And I'm thinking particularly of First Nations peoples, but people of colour, people on lower incomes, people who don't have access to the same education and opportunities that, we talk about the liberal tradition of free speech, but that's always been somewhat curtailed and limited to certain groups. And I think, as I said before, it's really about power. We can have those theoretical rights and abstract legal protections, but if in practice there are major power imbalances in society, that doesn't always count for as much. And it was interesting for me recently, the last wave of climate protests, I was getting contacted by quite a few public servants who were saying, "Oh, John, I really support the cause, wish we could be out there, but I'm worried that if I come along, I'll lose my job. I'm worried that even if I share a post on social media or click like on one of your posts, I'll get in trouble with my boss." So they weren't even doing that. But those are still people who have full-time jobs and some level of privilege in society. And so I think it's interesting to reflect on the fact that it's always like journalists who feel like, oh, they're attacking our free speech, and it's only once we get to the point of even the journalists start feeling attacked and besieged that we really start having in-depth conversations about this stuff. But maybe it's worth reflecting on the fact that some groups in society have never had free speech, as Karen was saying.
Peter, I just want to come back to what you said there. Do you agree with the New York Times headline from earlier this year that Australia may well be the world's most secretive democracy?
Yeah, I do. I do. And I think we need to qualify the word democracy. There's an awful lot of countries that also call themselves democracies that don't fully qualify, and I'm not suggesting that Australia, for example, is about to become Egypt anytime soon. But, you know, the University of New South Wales, under Professor George Williams, has been keeping a fairly close track of the number of national security legislations, laws that we've passed since 9/11, and the count currently stands at 82. Which is, again, more than any other democracy on earth. The net effect of that, I mean, all sorts of ways, a lot of those laws, and one of the things that we've been doing, my colleague at the law school, Rebecca and Annie Welsh, and my own research assistant, Richard Murray, have been really diving into the laws, mapping the impact of those laws specifically on journalism, and also looking at the way they impact on civil liberties. And most of them, in ways small and large, direct and indirect, intrude on not just on our freedom of speech and press freedom, but also overall generate, I think, a culture of secrecy. And I've worked in a lot of countries around the world. I've worked with a lot of governments and militaries and security services. And I promise you, I have not come across a single military, certainly in a Western democracy, that is as secretive as Australia's, as difficult to penetrate, as difficult to work with as Australia's. And I think that culture is also very much a part of our civil service. I have a real problem with that, but I think that really informs what the New York Times was saying, that we are right out there at the extreme end of secrecy in our government.
Do you agree with that, Graeme?
So I haven't done that level of study of that. I would, a cautionary word, because we're talking about power. If you want a Bill of Rights with the First Amendment, the very biggest value in your society is freedom of the press and freedom of speech. The US Supreme Court has developed that to the point where we couldn't, for instance, limit Clive Palmer. We couldn't say, as the Queensland government is about to say, you can't just spend $60 million to try and boost yourself or win an election, because that creates a power imbalance there. So be careful of what you wish for. Free speech written as if it's in the clouds is a nice idea, but then if you're trusting it to judges, I don't always trust the judges, hope none of my judge friends are out there, but you know, they come from particular classes in society, and free speech is certainly a very important value, but needs to be balanced with other values.
I reckon there'd be a lot of people hearing you say that tonight, Peter Greste, and think, what are you talking about? Mate, relax. We live in a country where you can say anything, do anything, you can be yourself. Has the public been tricked or too laid back to be sort of woke to the situation?
Well, I think Karen probably can speak for a lot of this.
I was just thinking, have you got a web page or a YouTube clip, as you was talking before?
Look, I think one of the things that we've discovered, and the research is still underway. We've just been literally in the last couple of weeks been doing a lot of the interviews, but all of the evidence that we've been gathering, and bear in mind, I'm talking very specifically now. Our work is focused very much on press freedom. But one of the things that we've discovered is that you don't need the raids, the high-profile raids like the AFP raids, the Australian Federal Police raids on 2 news organisations back in June this year, you don't need to be locking journalists up. You don't need to send soldiers in with jackboots to kick down the doors of news organisations for it to have a chilling effect. All of these pieces of legislation have made it very, very difficult for journalists to protect their sources. They've exposed journalists' data to overbearing investigation. They've criminalised a lot of what would have in the past have been considered as legitimate journalism. And what it's done is, as I said, without ever having to kick doors down, it's placed a very serious chilling effect on the oversight role that journalists should be playing when it comes to holding government to account. We're seeing sources and whistleblowers dry up because they're simply too afraid to come forward. They know that they're in danger of being exposed and having their careers destroyed. We're seeing journalists decide not to run stories because the costs of litigation are simply too high. They can't afford the risk of going to court and fighting these battles. And so it's like a straitjacket effect, if you like, on journalism. And I think we just don't really appreciate the effect that it's having because we haven't had those kinds of high-profile events. Let me say one more time before Jono takes over that I am absolutely not suggesting we are about to become an authoritarian dictatorship anytime soon. But I also think we're not as fully aware of the implications and the impact of this stuff on the way that our democracy works, and certainly not as alive to it as we should be.
Just following on from that, I probably don't need to explain the close connection between sort of free speech and the right to political assembly, so the freedom to gather in public places and participate in protests. But I think flowing on from that, it might be useful for people to be aware of some of the very explicit limitations that are placed on freedom of assembly, even here in Brisbane. And so most people would be unaware that often when protest organisers propose to hold a rally, even just in a public park or a square, not even blocking the road or anything, they're told they need to have public liability insurance. It's becoming increasingly common for the council to insist on regulations saying, yeah, you can have a protest, but you're not allowed to set up any shade, which obviously makes it hard for people to gather. You're not allowed to have a table and hand out flyers. You can have your protest, but you're not allowed to do any of the things that actually make a protest function. The state government goes so far now through the police to say to protest organisers, we want to see photos of the banners and the details of how wide, how big your signs are going to be, but as a precondition to the rally going ahead. And it's gotten to the point now that not so much for the experienced activists who understand what their legal rights are and are willing to push back, but for new community groups or people who might not have as much experience, they start organising protests. The police just say, no, you can't do that, and they just accept it. And they just say, oh, I guess we're not allowed to do it then, too bad. And I've had people put in grant applications to my office saying, oh, Councillor 3, can you please pay for our insurance so that we can have a protest? Like, that's pretty messed up. Yeah, it's, I guess, interesting to reflect on and how all those little ways that the state government, the police and council make protesting a little bit harder all combine to have the effect of discouraging the use of public spaces in general.
And that's before we get to...
roadblockage. Yeah.
Well, lock-on devices or secondary boycotts. We'll get to the Prime Minister's message in Brisbane last week. But Karen, in terms of the protest that you have been holding at Deebing Creek, how long have you been based there?
This is a new camp. This is the second camp we've now occupied. There's 4 properties out at the Grampian Drive. We've got state government statutory bodies like QSNTS and DATSIP that assume to represent the voice of our people. They have signed off on the sale of the Deebing Creek 9 Mile Reserve, which is the first point of contact for many people from the 1800s when Patrick Logan and John Oxley landed here and met with our people, and they set up a reserve at Deebing Creek. 6,000 people were processed through Deebing Creek. The majority of Queensland Aboriginal people have some sort of connection to Deebing Creek and northern New South Wales area. we have found that there's 3 trenches out there. They're full of bodies. And where we've learned the histories saying that we've got family in the cemetery, in graves, we had no idea that they're actually laying in these trenches. So it's prompted further investigation, but there's still a lot of other bodies there that we don't know where they are, and we don't want development there until we've had an inquiry, even how the 2 Cultural Heritage Protection Acts were lifted to sell the property. So that's why we're protesting, and we've occupied the area. But when we want to talk back to what Peter was saying about secret laws and stuff like that that's going on, Deebing Creek is a classic. They've covered up. There's so much that's happened out there, and the change of legislations. We've got a seal from Queen Victoria from the 1800s, 1890s, where she's granted the lands back to our people. And just even with not just the cultural heritage that we want to save, there's also a real lot of environmental aspects to Deebing Creek Reserve. With we've got a rare tea tree forest. We've got rare birds, plants, koalas, goannas, the whole lot there. And capitalism really is killing us. And it's sad that we see our creeks and rivers and our wildlife just deteriorating before our eyes in our own lifetime. And we've got to really sit up and really take notice to what we're saying yes to, and who we are putting into positions of influence within the political parties, into the parliaments. We've got to really know who they are. Back in the day, we used to know people more closely before social media. You really have to know who you're voting for these days, because there's so many people that just have corporate agendas and push the corporate empire's reign of destruction upon the lands, and it's not helping. And we've got 3 heat waves just this year and the beginning of this year. In the first week of summer, we've had heat waves already in spring. These are things that we've got to take notice to, and I can't help it. But yeah, I still feeling about Deebing Creek, and I just really, my heart bleeds, because they've got so much animal life and so much history and heritage out there that's just being swallowed up and hidden. And we don't get media attention to put out any kind of information for people, or we don't get supported to say, come and we'll give you history talks of the area, because we've got statutory bodies that have made laws, made agreements and deals with people and corporations, and exclusive of the very people that have connections to these places. And that's what happens a lot within legislation when it comes to our people.
Is anyone from the state government listening to you? I mean, you've got an Environment Minister in Leanne Enoch, you've got the Deputy Premier and Treasurer in Jackie Trad, who's also the Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs. Are they listening to you?
No, they haven't. They don't at all. It's Jono and his team that's really stepped up to support us. We've said 2 properties we've had to occupy, and that was one's with the Fraser property. That was at the beginning of the year, in March. We occupied, and just recently, last week, we've just occupied another area near where the cemetery site is. And we want answers, but because we've got these statutory bodies in place that weren't elected, we're not asked for, we march for land rights, we never march for DATSIP or QSNTS. So yeah, but unfortunately, if you want to know about secret politics, oh God, and journalists aren't allowed to touch our stuff. They'll get wrapped over the knuckles, and it's culturally inappropriate and everything if they even touch our stuff. So, we're in between a rock and a hard place, trying to manoeuvre through legislation, statutory bodies, and the wider public. And the education is just not there enough for the wider public to be able to really stand with us, because we're just ostracised beyond what you really... ostracised beyond hope, really.
Can I just pick up on something there? Because I think it touches on a really interesting point, which I've encountered both with Deviant Creek and a few other issues, is that the way the media is disciplined by the political establishment to not cover certain stories or to marginalise certain stories. Like, what's happening out at Deebing Creek is huge. It should be front page news. The fact that Aboriginal people within 50, 100 kilometres of Brisbane are occupying their land, claiming their rights to that place, resisting it, like that is a big story that people are interested in. But journalists are continually told by the political establishment, no, that's not an important story. And journalists are disciplined because politicians drip feed them stories and they say, we'll give you an exclusive, we'll give you an insight on this story, or we'll give you a heads up about this issue so that you can get the scoop and you can get the headline. And so there's this close relationship of influence between the mainstream media and the major parties where they go hand in hand, they support each other. The politicians know that they want to give good stories to the journalists, and the journalists know they don't want to piss off the politicians too much because they won't get those good stories. So it's very easy for politicians in positions of power to bury certain stories or to discourage certain stories from getting covered, or to ensure they're covered in a different way by using those levers of power. And every now and then I hear from Courier Mail journalists who are frustrated because they're like, oh, Jono, the Liberals aren't giving me any exclusives this week. It's like, well, is that how it normally works? That you guys just have this cosy deal? Anyway, I could go on. But
Is that your sense, Peter Greste, of how the media and politics, mainstream media and politics in Australia works?
Okay, I haven't worked in Australian journalism for a long time. I've been watching it and observing it from the outside. I mean, I think the reason I'm struggling to answer this is that it's not a sort of necessarily consciously designed system. I'm not as cynical as that, but there is a symbiosis that exists, and part of it is because of the poverty that the media is struggling with at the moment. The fact that there is that the business models are broken, and we don't have journalists who have the experience or the contacts. We don't have news organisations with the resources just to send a journalist off for a week on an investigation without having to produce stuff on a daily basis. And so it's very, very difficult for journalists to operate with the kind of independence that they really need. It also means that they tend to be more reliant on political leaks.
And on media releases.
And on media releases, exactly. And so it's not necessarily that we have this kind of grand conspiracy of a relationship between politicians and news organisations. I don't believe that there's any evil sort of genius who sat down there and decided to design this system. But for a whole host of structural reasons that we haven't necessarily understood until fairly recently, we've seen these changes have the effect of stifling a lot of legitimate journalism and stopping the media from operating in the way that it should in a healthy democracy.
Ladies and gents, you're going to get to turn journalists tonight. You'll be able to put your own questions to anyone on the panel in around about 20 minutes' time. So if this is sparking ideas in your mind, just store up your questions, and in 15, 20 minutes' time, we'll have microphones around, and we'd love for you to kick this discussion along. I want to have a look at social media in amongst this discussion. And perhaps just a quick response from each of you first up. Do you think social media enhances free speech, Graeme Orr?
Yes and no.
Karen?
Yo.
You've talked about social media in your campaign?
It definitely has for us.
It has?
Been at times it's been the only voice.
Mm-hmm. Jono?
Yeah, I've had mixed experiences with it, but I don't think I would be able to reach as big an audience as I do without using it, and I probably wouldn't have gotten elected without clever use of it. And so, yeah, it certainly has its problems, but we can talk about that in more detail if you like.
Yeah, I agree with them all. Look, I mean, the problem that I have with social media is, and I absolutely recognise the way that it's given voices to that wouldn't otherwise have had voices in marginalised communities, but I also see the way in which it's degraded our confidence in information, because on social media all information appears equal, and we know all information is not equal, and so without any kind of way of filtering out information, it's very difficult for us to have conversations based on a common understanding of what the issues really are and what the facts of any issues are. And so at one level it's given voice, but at another level it's degraded confidence and trust in facts, in information. And I think that's had a very corrosive effect on the quality of public debate and free expression.
Hashtag fake news. Graeme Orr, should social media companies be in the business of fact-checking information?
Well, in a way they already are. I mean, it's interesting to see Twitter in the US now say they won't take any paid political advertising at all because it's all too difficult. And if they fully police that as a neutral policy, that will be very interesting. Difficult to see how they define political and track all these things algorithmically. But I mean, I deal with journalists and all sorts of people every day on news stories, for instance, and I certainly have found the last 20 years a shift. More and more I'm just saying to journalists, no, that's not a story there. Maybe there's an ethical issue that you want to discuss, there's something deeper going on here, but because of the drive to get traffic and clickbaits, which is partly a product of social media, there is, as Peter said, a certain degradation of what we want, which presumably is trustable information, or at least good opinions based upon information, and then you get something like the right to know as freedom of information. Not many people who are sitting at home blogging know how to use freedom of information laws or could afford to pay for the information. Yeah. You do need investment in good journalism in that regard.
And maybe can we problematise a little bit this idea of, like, social media has changed a lot even in sort of the last 5 years, but it's theoretically possible to have a social media spaces where people do sort of all have roughly even access, and good ideas might be sort of upvoted, and you can look at examples like Wikipedia that have a long history and a positive culture of fact-checking and verification. But organisations like Facebook have a vested commercial interest in division and in peddling rumours and exaggeration, etc. And their algorithms reward certain kinds of information sharing and discourage and disincentivise other forms of information sharing. And I learned that, and I'm disciplined by that, because I gradually realise and learn through use of social media that when I post stuff that's a bit more controversial or slightly veering towards hyperbole, it's likely to travel further, and the algorithm rewards that.
One of the things that I think we forget with social media is that it's been incredibly effective at doing what it was originally intended to do, and that's harvest our attention and monetize that for the shareholders of the companies, the social media companies in Silicon Valley. You have to acknowledge that and to a certain extent applaud their genius at doing it. But what it is not designed to do is encourage good, healthy public discussion, public debate. And I am convinced, I'm not a software engineer, so I have no real ideas about how to do it, but I suspect that if we said, no, social media actually is a public utility and it needs to be redesigned, re-engineered to serve the public, then I'm pretty sure that we'd find that the engineers, the same engineers that have so successfully monetized our attention and developed algorithms that, as Jono said, actually create polemic, if anything, encourage polemic and rumour and all sorts of stuff. If it was to be re-engineered in a way that served the public good, then we'd end up with something that was actually much more useful to us as in a democracy. It's just that we don't necessarily see it or understand it when we use it because it's so ubiquitous.
That's great, but how could you do that? Who would be the gatekeeper of that information, of what gets promoted or discussed or approved in that process?
As I said, I'm not a software engineer, and this is where we really start to. But I think this is the point, that these are the kinds of ideas that we need to push into our public debate and public discussion to say, okay, is this actually helping us as a community? I mean, it is so effective. It is so much a part of our life, our community life. Last year, it was the year before last, I did a film for Four Corners on Facebook. And one of the reasons we did it was because Mark Zuckerberg published a manifesto in which he said what his ambition was for Facebook. And Facebook was the place where we conducted our political life, our economic life, our social life. It's a place where we conducted commerce, where we conducted political debates, where we actually did our voting. And I thought, well, if that's what your ambition is, then what you're saying is that you want Facebook to be a public utility, so let's make it a public utility. It cannot serve us Australians or Australian democracy if it's run by a guy
For profit.
for profit out of Silicon Valley in a place that's beyond the reach of our own legislation. And so if we rethink it, reimagine it, then I think we can put it to our own use. We just need to start having those conversations, and we're not.
Can I just briefly throw in one other idea, which is that, yes, definitely social media and certain forums can become quite toxic, and when they're poorly moderated, etc. I think a lot comes down to good moderation and facilitation. But part of our narrative of, we live in a more divided society and it's more adversarial and there's more confrontation, part of that is a breakdown of respect and etc. But part of it is just that dissenting voices and marginalised voices have now been uplifted, so that previously there might have been a dominant discourse or a dominant narrative in society, and that was the only narrative. And now suddenly alternative voices are able to say, oh, actually that's racist, or oh no, you are oppressing me. And we call that division when we say, oh, society's become more divided. Actually, it's finally the people who were being oppressed and were under the heel for so long finally have a little bit of a voice to articulate an alternative narrative. And that, maybe we call that division, but actually that's also a form of empowerment. So it's worth reflecting on that as well, I think.
One of the issues with the social media, with the Recognise campaign that was put on us a few years ago, it was the Facebook, Twitter, social media that we utilised to raise awareness of a vote no against the Recognise.
Karen, do you think social media companies have a responsibility to censor hate speech?
Well, they say they do, but I think that's selective as well.
Yeah. I think there's an ethical responsibility that if you're creating a platform, you should be moderating it in some way. The question is who's making those decisions, and are these forums controlled democratically? Again, I keep coming back to Wikipedia, but they've developed a culture of moderation and facilitation where it's not perfect, but they do rein in hate speech and misinformation, and it's because the community around that open source platform has some level of control, whereas Facebook, I wouldn't trust a big corporation to decide what is and isn't hate speech because they've got their own motives.
LinkedIn is another one too, another social media space which operates with a great deal more sort of civility and respect, and it's partly because of the culture of the place, I think. I don't know and understand how the algorithms work, but there's an example of a way in which I think it can operate without the kind of vitriol which we often see.
Graeme, what is horizontal censorship?
Right, so most of what we've been talking tonight has been about traditional ideas of control of speech or sanctions against speech that come top down, so from law or government action, or even defamation, judge-made law that might chill journalists and so on. But increasingly, power in societies is wielded through corporations, universities, large organisations, who themselves sometimes censor, sometimes restrain, sometimes sanction speech. I don't want to talk about the unmentionable Mr. Folau, but that's a cause célèbre at the moment. This is one of a series of cases you could talk about in terms of, say, someone who's lost their job because of some series of inane tweets. Now, you might dislike what he says, or you might think anti-discrimination law should apply to what he says, but to lose his job, and I've followed rugby league for years, good athletes can be nongs from the shoulders up. What you're tweeting in your spare time, it's not because you're private, it's because this is just his opinion, and it seems over the top that he could lose his job over this kind of thing. But we could talk about journalists like Scott McIntyre lost his job with SBS over tweeting some stuff against Anzac Day. It's not just in employment, though employment obviously is a big sanction if you lose your job and your livelihood. Here's another example. Just at the last election, I think one of the Fraser Anning mob went into an Officeworks store not far from here and tried to print off some electioneering material, and the Officeworks people said, no, we don't want to print this stuff. Now, fascists can go down the road and there's another place to print it. It's not like he's being denied access to a marketplace. But we're going to have a bigger discussion about whether we regulate and how we regulate some of these responses by people with private power, organisations, employers and so on, to say, no, I'm not going to deal with you, I don't like your speech, all the way through to, the Powerhouse saying, we're not going to hold this event here because we don't like the topic.
Jono, what do you reckon? Does a corporation have a right to decide who does and doesn't get to keep their job based on their status updates in their private time?
I didn't follow this whole Israel Folau saga very closely, but I think it's worth remembering, he's a public figure. We might call him a sportsman, but part of his contract and part of the role of these sports people is that they are essentially public figures, and there isn't a clear separation between your private life and your public life, and I think it's naive to pretend otherwise. I think also, though, we can lapse into the dangerous territory of thinking that all speech is equally valid, whereas there are forms of hate speech that do serious harm and damage. And if someone is saying something that is actively harming other people, and I suggest that maybe Folau's comments probably did that, then I think there is a case for limiting that speech in some way. I think there's an important distinction to be drawn between, say, someone with a big platform like him and some level of institutional privilege being disciplined by their employer, as opposed to a public servant or an employee who isn't necessarily part of a public role. They're two very different kinds of cases, and I think there's value in that distinction. But just in general, hate speech shouldn't be tolerated in the public realm, and I think the more important conversation is, okay, what counts as hate speech, rather than should we censor hate speech, or should we deny people a platform if they're engaging in hate speech?
There was another example where, just forgotten her handle at the moment, but an employee of the immigration department was...
LA Legal, I think she called herself,
yeah.
Ms. Banerjee.
Yeah. La Legal, LA Legal. Do you want to just explain, can you recall the dot points of what happened there in terms of what she was querying with regards to her department?
So Ms. Banerjee, behind her Twitter handle, was being scathing about the opposition and the government, about immigration issues. She was working in that department. It became quite clear to the department who she was. Some of the things she said were not revealing national security secrets and so on, but in the end she was dismissed, and she suffered, I think, some depression based upon that. She sued, both for unfair, unlawful dismissal, but also over a workers' compensation claim. Ultimately, she lost in the High Court. The High Court said that you couldn't just say because you used a seemingly anonymous Twitter handle that therefore as a public servant you weren't subject to the usual kind of rules that says that public servants have to appear to be relatively neutral. Now, those rules have been around for a long time. There's some good reasons for them. The reality is, if you're a public servant and you speak up in favour of the government, you're not so likely to suffer consequences.
Do you think that was a good decision at law? Because I was shocked by that outcome.
I wasn't shocked. I think it certainly needs to be more nuanced. There's a lot of other things going on in that case, including that there are a lot of protections for public servants that often ordinary workers don't get in terms of fair treatment and so on.
But the chilling effect that one had, like immediately after that case, I saw a change in public servants at the council level, people I interact with at the state government, who felt much more concerned about expressing their views to me directly and expressing their views online. So that one case, that's one isolated example, but the flow-on effects to society are dramatic.
Did you see parallels between her and Israel Folau then, or not?
Potentially, and look, John's point, I think it's about power. It's a correct one. I think I've advocated we should have a law that says employers, you can't go dismissing and sanctioning employees for non-work related speech, no matter whether you put it into a policy or not, unless those people are being paid a mozza to be management or to be the brand, associated with the brand. Because then I think it's quite understandable that organisations they have a right, if you like, to disassociate themselves from speech that they find difficult, ugly, doesn't fit with their social brand. But generally, no.
Well, speaking of people who are paid a mozza, Alan Joyce, who got married on the weekend, congrats, Alan, the boss of Qantas, does he have a right to speak out in favour of same-sex marriage?
Clearly, yes. He does it through his being, I guess, as well. Then you say, well, does he have a right to use Qantas letterhead? Well, I guess that's a matter for Qantas shareholders to take up, but he's positioning Qantas in an international market to be progressive. I'm not necessarily going to agree with everything the corporation does, to try and control an agenda in relation to recognise, but I would, I guess, much rather that different corporations, given they have power in society, take a differing range of opinions rather than just be one type of money-making machine.
Just while we're in the territory of big business, and we're a couple of minutes away from you guys taking over the conversation, I just want to go to the Prime Minister's comments in Brisbane last Friday. Scott Morrison was here speaking out against what he described as radical activism. So that was one layer of speech he was interested in. The next layer was about boycotts, essentially secondary boycotts, consumer boycotts that might be forced from so-called radical activists pressuring businesses. Do you see how you spend your money as freedom of expression, Peter Greste? And do you think that a politician can suggest how you should or shouldn't spend your money?
No. I mean, look, this is where I start to think when Scott Morrison brands the people who are urging secondary boycotts as anarchists, I think we're sort of stretching the bounds of political control to a ridiculous extent. I actually think that, we all have a right to use our money and our speech in those kinds of ways. That's how political movements develop. We wouldn't have apartheid without a lot of the campaign to end apartheid was focused on secondary boycotts of companies that did business with South Africa. Nobody beyond the South Africans, I think, complained about that. Everyone accepted that as legitimate. It's the story of so many social movements, particularly social movements that develop ahead of the politicians. And so I think that this is frankly quite a troubling statement. I don't agree with it at all.
I don't think it's obviously manifestly ridiculous that we would make it illegal for someone to say to a business, don't deal with that other business because they're problematic. Like, that's just stupid. I think what's interesting to me is that people are surprised that Morrison is making these kinds of statements, because there's still a certain naivety in society of, we forget that, of course, these people are just shills for big business. And of course, as soon as certain tactics start to be used effectively, they're going to try and shut down those tactics. We see that with the lock-on laws, we see that with the boycotts, we see that with a whole range of areas. Like, why is anyone surprised that they would do this? When he announced it, I was like, oh yeah, of course that was going to come.
Were you surprised, Graeme?
Look, I'm surprised because I don't think it's going to be constitutional, whatever he tries to draft, but I actually think he's flying a kite that Peter Costello, if you remember him in 2007, flew the same kite and got nowhere with it. I think he's trying to create an us and them division. It's his free speech and expression. It's his way of trying to frame a debate as being, there are good, quiet shareholders, there are hard-working companies that are only interested in profits, and then there's them, the progressives, the anarchists, and so on. And it's a failing cause because, particularly with social media and the sense that we're all just consumers now, even people on the conservative side of politics are also using this idea of boycotting, of taking their business away from another business to try and create leverage, because we all, at one level, agree that we don't just live in an economy, we live in a society, and economy serves society, and social values affect the economy.
Yeah, well, I think what got forgotten in Friday's speech was that not too long ago, Senator Matt Canavan encouraged people to boycott, I think it was Westpac, in relation to them not lending money to a particular mining company. All right, ladies and gents, this is your opportunity to not be quiet Australians, to take up the microphone and put your questions to people on the couch. You can ask a question to one person in particular or to any and all. Keep your questions short and sharp, or I will channel the Tony Jones. I'll take that as a comment. Tony Jones is going to be in Brisbane next week as well, by the way. He's written another book, fiction book. He's off to China soon. All right, who do we have? It's hard for us to see, so it's quite dim up the back, though. Or just here. Hello.
Hello. My name is Thor Prohaska. I was the independent candidate in Dixon the last two elections against Peter Dutton. And I've come to the conclusion that we cannot beat the organised political gangs at their own game. We have to change the game. But along with that, I've come to the conclusion that we do not actually live in a democracy. And I came to this conclusion because I trawled through our constitution. Okay, you want me to go straight to the question? The question is this. Okay, Australia's not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. So how can we have free speech until Australia is legally a democracy, or how can we have any other freedoms? That's the question.
You want to have a crack, Jono?
I agree that we don't live in a functional democracy. I think it's fair to say it's some form of oligarchy or kleptocracy. I think the question of how do we challenge that really comes down to community organising, developing alternative forms of deliberative democracy at the local level, and building a counter-hegemony that challenges the hegemonic influence of multinational corporations over our democratic system. But as long as we live in a capitalist system where vested interests have a strong profit motive in influencing and hijacking our democracy, there will always be ways for our political system to be hijacked. If you can make money by manipulating democracy, you're going to find a way to do it. So to talk about democratic reform or strengthening our democracy without also talking about the financial motives that drive corporations to corrupt our democracy, I think misses the point. The two are intimately connected.
But don't you agree that the whole system has failed everyone?
Big time.
Big time.
Yeah.
And that when he said that about the game, changing the game,
Yeah,
sounds
exactly.
more inviting than what we're suffering.
Exactly.
Yes. Hello, up the back.
Hi. Oh, thank you so much. My name is Tenzin. Let me introduce myself, please, because I'm quite new to all of you and vice versa. My name is Tenzin. I was born in Tibet, raised in India, but settled in Australia just last year. So I want to thank the people and government of Australia for allowing me to stay in this country. Thank you so much. When I came to Australia, I didn't know that Australia doesn't have a president. So my question will be relating to if Australia can become a republic, and that too, if it can be from an Aboriginal or Indigenous people. Because I see that there's such a big size of Australia is being ruled or as a head of state from a small island far away. So it is possible or not? Thank you so much.
Karen, do you want to have a crack? Should we have a president? Should it be an Indigenous president?
What I really do advocate for is I declare that I'm a sovereign to these lands, an original sovereign, which is the Australian government's foundation really needs to be checked. The British Australian government system that's currently operating is illegitimate, and everybody knows it. It's been whispered about and spoken about for many years, and the legitimacy of the sovereignty is illegitimate. And we might be only 3% of the population, but under every law, internationally, local and domestic, the first people are the original sovereigns to these lands and still are the traditional, not just traditional, still are the owners of these lands. That has never been disputed. It was proven in the Mabo High Court. None of our First Nations people ever agreed to the native title being put in place. What actually did happen was Terra Nullius got kicked out in the High Court, and then Terra Nullius got reinstated again through the native title. We live in a society where the 2 centuries, the people of these lands are happy to see that the first people are non-existent, unrepresented. There's nothing exists in these lands that say that we live here. And that's what my hope is, not for a new government or anything, but the truth, and to legitimise the true governance of these lands. I really, really would love to see a new country. We've got a history where our country was based on a penal colony. It still is legitimately a penal colony of England. We've got to fix this. We all really need to go back to the drawing board, the start, and fix it on that level. And then only till then are we going to see a thriving country. Other than that, he's hiding. The whole government's based on a whole lot of hidden history and corruption that they've just kept precept upon precept, line upon line of lies, and it needs to be rechecked. And that's why we really do need our academics challenging those sort of things, and our politicians, which has been really great. Jono's done a wonderful job on the grassroots level for giving us a voice and standing by us, even though we stand far left of what wider Australia stand for.
Thanks, Karen. Graeme, you mentioned the Uluru Statement. Just on the question of a republic in Australia, have you got a view on how you think things will progress there?
Having a president as a spokesperson wrapped up, even an Indigenous one, it's going to be tokenism. So I don't think, it'd be nice. I'm a Republican, but I don't think it's a first order issue in terms of fixing politics, let alone other deeper issues.
Peter Greste, do you have a view on Australia becoming a republic?
Oh, I think it's long overdue. I watching it from abroad, it's really been interesting coming back as someone. I spent 26 years outside of Australia, so in a lot of respects, I often take an outsider's view of Australia, even though I am obviously very much an Australian. And the idea that we still live in a system where our notional head of state is the Queen of England is still just ridiculous on a whole host of levels. Constitutionally, there are all sorts of flaws and problems that it creates, and I think it absolutely needs to happen.
Hello.
Oh, hello. This is for anyone on the panel, and I'm going to bring it down to a very everyday example.
Great.
When I have family members or old friends that post something on social media that I really disagree with, part of me wants to unfollow them or block them so that other people who might be reading don't get to see it and think that I endorse particular views. But wouldn't that just reinforce the kind of silo bubble effect where you're only seeing people's views that kind of echo your own? What do you think about that sort of very everyday freedom of speech?
I've grappled with this one a lot because on my Facebook page I don't really block anyone. I think maybe in 4 years I've blocked like one person perhaps, and that's part of the reason I have so many trolls and so much aggressive division on my pages and comments threads. But I've made a deliberate decision to do that because I want progressive people who live in their little progressive bubbles to see how messed up the world is and how far we still have to go. And so on that space I deliberately keep it an open platform. But I think there's no obligation or necessarily always a lot of value in tolerating people who are just there to troll and just have hateful views. Like, it doesn't enrich discourse, it doesn't foster mutual understanding or lead to a more robust discussion. It's just trolling. So I think it kind of depends on what your goals are with any particular platform or thread, or what you see as the purpose of that discussion space is probably the best way to think of it. Do you have a view on that? Oh.
Just on a personal note, how do you cope with that? Because that's got to take a toll on you.
Yeah, it's emotionally exhausting, and there'll be certain weeks where I'll just be like, all right, I'm not going to read any of the comments this week. But I think I've got good support networks and have been quite deliberate about knowing when to switch off and trying to distance myself from it. But it's quite addictive. And when you know that there are thousands of people posting on your page directly calling you out and saying mean things about it, you want to respond and you want to read that. So it kind of drags you back in and draws you in. But
I won't directly answer that question because it's my wife who asked it, and she probably has blocked me, but rightly. But it does speak to another issue that we haven't touched too much on, and I mentioned the idea, I guess, of knowing respectful speech and manner in speech. Then it gets to the question of not just speaking but listening, and how do we negotiate that, particularly in a cacophony like social media.
And particularly for elected reps, like if elected representatives are getting to the point where they're using social media as a form of engagement where the people they represent can access them and share their views with their representative, for elected reps to then be blocking people who disagree with them or criticise them, I think is more problematic. I think it's different for just general members of the public or other public figures. But it's quite common for a lot of politicians to just block people who continually criticise them, and that means those people no longer have a voice to access that person.
Can I just add? One of the issues I find too is the news reports. When it's a First Nations issue, a lot of racists get on and the news channels actually allow a lot of the...
They don't moderate.
Yeah, they don't moderate
when
at
they
all.
Should.
Yeah, and they allow all this talk. So we've just tried to generate, just telling off our own Facebook post to report the disrespect and the foul language and stuff like that.
And is it sometimes dismissed as, well, this is freedom of speech? People have a right to be hateful, to be bigots.
And it's really disgusting because it might be even a death in custody, child dying or something like that. It's just bigotry, prejudice. It's absolutely, horrific to see that actual news channels actually don't moderate at all.
And it causes physical pain and physical harm in the real world. It's not like words and ideas are over here and actions and results are over here. The two are intimately linked. And when people say mean things, that has real world outcomes and impacts.
Well, if we're going to turn around and look at Folau's case, for instance, but it doesn't apply here.
It's a great question, and I hope that you and Graeme can stay friends in life and on Facebook or wherever it is you're liking each other.
Hi, my name's Daniel. I'm just a 16-year-old high school student. I just came here tonight just to ask all of you just one question. So with the recent lock-on laws you guys were talking about earlier with Extinction Rebellion, I've been involved in a lot of those protests recently. How do we see some democratic change in our society and also our government in order to actually bring about climate justice? Because as a 16-year-old, I'm growing up in a society where I might not actually have a future, my job may not be secured, my housing may not be secured, and the environment is falling apart, possibly in my lifetime. How do you feel that we can get to this point of climate justice and basically where if Australia does actually make big changes, can that have a ripple effect across the world, and how will that ripple effect happen?
Go on, Jono.
I'm happy to go. I have done a lot of activism, obviously, but I made an explicit decision to engage with electoral politics because I saw that as a valuable and useful pathway. And so I think part of the answer to your question is to vote them out and to organise within your communities to replace corrupt politicians with politicians who are more responsive to the needs of the community and the long-term public interest. So I think it is worth engaging with the political establishment or the political machine in some way, because really politicians and political leaders, they care about power. So they care about money from their corporate donors because that helps them get more power. But really what they care about is votes. And until you start removing them from office or taking votes off them, it's very easy for them to dismiss you. So I think there's a lot of value in electoral organising, but I think we also need to develop alternative systems of bottom-up deliberative democracy so that we have power dispersed throughout society, because whoever you elect and put at the top of the pyramid is going to be susceptible to the corrupting influence of power. So rather than just trying to replace people and put good people at the top, we need to flatten that pyramid and share decision-making power around to better insulate against corruption. So I think it's a bit of both, but we all need to be putting more time and energy into things like this, where we're experimenting with different forms of civil society and deliberative democracy so that we have an alternative to hierarchical representative democracy.
Peter, again from the Australian and with the foreign eyes on the civil unrest that's happening around the world, and Australia, part of the young man's question was, can Australia have an influence on what the world is doing? That's often the argument that's put back to those who protest locally is, really what difference can Australia make?
Yeah, I think that's patently ridiculous. I mean, We have little laws. Each person on their own makes no difference to the overall status of litter, but we say you're not allowed to litter and we'll come down on you like a ton of bricks if you do, because collectively it all matters. And I think that, maybe the analogy is slightly flawed, but I don't think it's imperfect in this, because I think we punch above our weight internationally as a democracy. We still, as a champion of a lot of smaller liberal values, again, I don't fully understand why, but we do. And I think that the more we take a lead on these issues, particularly around climate and social justice and human rights and so on, the more capacity we've got to speak with moral authority. There is a reason that the Scandinavian countries have so much influence around the world, and that's not because they have massive numbers of people or massive economies. It's because they actually seem to operate with a fairly high degree of principle, and I think that we need to recognise that moral authority on a global stage counts for something.
Graeme, what's your take on the declaration of climate emergencies at various levels of government? Do you think that actually will or can translate to legislative change?
Not necessarily. They're obviously expressive acts, and parliaments and other representative bodies do have a role to show leadership on matters that are so blatantly in the public long-term interest. But when it comes to climate justice, I think it's about another type of power, and it's about psychology, and I think it's deeply rooted in the Australian psychology that your power is based upon the amount of revs you get out of your engine in your car, and that was shown in the election, the way that the government talked about they're going to take away your petrol engines. Until we have an affordable equivalent power source, I think it's going to be difficult in this country to get the same kind of traction that the issue has had more rationally elsewhere.
So if electric vehicles revved...
Rev for Trev, that'll be my new slogan, yeah. But we're probably getting a bit off the topic.
It's a great question. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Sal. I'm a student from the University of Queensland. And there was a little bit of a discussion on tonight about, at a government level, the passage of laws that are put forward in a national security sense that it could be considered to be curtailing the freedom of speech. And I wonder if part of the reason this happens is because at a community level, we either feel placated or we don't care. And so my question is, at a grassroots community level, what could we be doing to further foster an appreciation for freedom of speech and for freedom of association?
Do you want to have a go, Graeme? Peter?
I'm very good at analysing it. I'm not sure I've got the solutions to offer you. Jono was going to pitch.
I think we have to. We protect these institutions by using them and practicing. So every time we gather in a public space, or every time we hold a community forum where we're sharing ideas with each other, we're reinforcing our right to engage in discourse, and we're asserting that that's a thing that's valuable in society. So it's kind of a use it or lose it approach, I guess. But every time they tell us we shouldn't be protesting or gathering in a public space, we should be doing it more and simply resisting that through our actions. And I think certainly at the grassroots level, the more people who take it upon themselves to organise community forums or discussion spaces or reading groups, whether it's a big thing with 50 people or 100 people, or whether it's just you and 5 or 6 mates and you have a barbecue or a dinner party and you say, let's set aside some time to talk about the big issues rather than just like the gossip stuff. I think that's an important act as well. And when we foster a strong culture of vibrant political discourse where it's just normal in society for everyone to be talking about important issues, then when they try to take it away or strip back that freedom, people automatically resist and it becomes harder for the government to do so.
Peter, maybe just dovetailing at the back of that, maybe if I could frame it in terms of, when the AFP, the Federal Police, showed up at the ABC with a warrant for notes, for diaries, for emails, anything in connection with the investigation into Australian Special Forces over possible war crimes in Afghanistan. Why does that matter to Barry on Bribie Island?
It matters massively, because the problem is that not everybody has the capacity to hold government to account. I mean, free speech is really important. Freedom of the press is a subset of freedom of speech. But freedom of the press exists as a subset for a very particular reason, and that's because the press has a responsibility to hold government to account in ways that ordinary people cannot do on their own. That free speech on its own is no substitute for that, because what the press does, and I'm very careful to point that the function of the press or function of journalism rather than journalists themselves that we need to be protecting. The problem is that when you have that kind of assault on journalists and their sources, what you do is crush the capacity of journalists to perform that function, that watchdog function. And if we take that away, there is nothing else that can step into that breach. As much as free speech on its own is really important, and the collective free speech that people generate is really helpful, it cannot run the kinds of investigations that require deep contacts, a lot of experience, the capacity to check facts, to produce stories that expose the kinds of abuses that we've seen over the years, that break open things like, create the royal commissions into aged care, into the banking scandal, that create the Fitzgerald inquiry and so on. It's hard to point to any royal commission that didn't start with aggressive journalism in the first place. And so we need to understand the impact of the AFP raids, not just on that particular story, but on the wider function of journalism in our democracy.
Does the government have any right to push back on that? And to use another example that Mark Willisey revealed to me recently, he said that there was a consultant which he said was more like a private investigator taken on by the state government to approach him and his producer about some of his sources. Does the state government have any right to push back on something like that?
No, look...
Or state or federal government, sorry?
No, I don't know quite why they're hiring consultants when they've got metadata. They've got access to all sorts of electronic tools to do the job that an investigator or consultant can do without the expense either. Look, one of the things that is constantly comes up is the need to balance national security, to protect national security. And we've come to the point, and national security, of course, was used as the justification for the AFP raids. One of the things that we've come to do is regard national security and press freedom as if it's a binary choice. If we have more of one, by definition, you have less of the other. And that in these fraught, troubled times, we need to keep ourselves physically safe. That's the priority of the government that we're constantly told. But one of the things that we forget is that if national security is about anything, it is, yes, about ensuring our own physical safety, but it is also about protecting the integrity of our democratic system. And I accept a lot of the criticisms that we've heard tonight about our democracy, but let's face it, one of the reasons that we live in one of the safest, most stable and prosperous places on the planet, for all of its flaws, and I can see Karen shaking her head, but we, come on.
Safe for rich white people.
Well, is...
Sorry, go on.
No, is that we've had a system that's worked, and worked to a certain extent. And again, let's quote Winston Churchill: "Democracy is the worst system of government apart from all of the others." But if in trying to keep us physically safe, we're actually doing more violence to one of the key pillars of the system that has actually made us as stable and prosperous as we are in the first place, then actually national security isn't served. We need to understand that these two are not a binary that are in opposition to one another, that we need to protect some of the fundamentals of our system. Yes, by all means, let's understand and recognise the inequalities and inequities that it's created in the first instance, but we also need to understand that globally we actually do live in a very stable, prosperous place. And we need to understand what it is that's got us there and make sure that we don't undermine it in the process.
I feel like, Karen, we should give you a chance to respond to some extent to that, not to Peter personally, but more broadly, the concept of in this country, often we do come back to the idea that, yeah, we're pretty stable, we're pretty prosperous. How often do you feel like that?
It's not very often. Even the common man here, there's no security under the system. We're all contracted in jobs. Mortgages are through the roof. There's no security even with your children's schools, your education, jobs, trades. You know, like, where do people get a trade these days? When that sustains countries throughout the world for years. The loss of jobs everywhere, being replaced by technology is unbelievable, and the capitalism in this country is through the roof. There should be a cap on capitalism, or outlawed one time, because it's just unbelievable that unemployment, we've got job networks capitalising off unemployment. Just what Jono was saying before about, you know, like, sort of bringing things back down to the community. You know, we had community police. We grew up with community police, not imported police from other towns and other states. We knew the police. And since they've centralised policing and, you know, and only force-fed the community with the jobs that the government only sanctions, which is mining, is the first. And then, you know, the labour market's nearly non-existent. And why should it all go to mining? Why should it all go to destructive ventures and not rehabilitation ventures? We've got creeks and rivers that are dry and waterways, yet we've got big dams sitting right beside big mining ventures. This is going on all over the country, and the common man is missing out. There's a lot of people that are very comfortable, and they're only a minority of this country, but the majority of this country is feeling the weight of the system and their legislations that are choking the hell out of everyone.
But Karen, can I ask you, how do you think things have deteriorated or improved recently over the years?
There's too much. You know, we had small business. I grew up in Inala, which is a low socioeconomic area. Palaszczuk's lectorate. Anastasia Palaszczuk, sorry, the premier. We grew up with the milk run, milk boys and girls, bakery run, where there was that much businesses for a child. I was one of the first girls on the paper run that we would come in the city selling newspapers. We had jobs for local businesses. Every shopping centre had Chinese, a hardware, a shopping centre where even people packed the bags. Now we've got hardly anything.
Okay, the reason I'm asking this is because I actually think what you're saying supports my point, and that is that for all sorts of reasons, because of the way the digital revolution has broken the media, and I think in a lot of ways has made civil political discourse, has damaged it, because of the way that the laws have, I think, degraded the capacity of journalism to do its job, we're seeing overall a degrading of the quality of public and political discourse and political debate, and we're winding up with a situation which is less functional than it used to be. And so what I'm saying is that I agree with you, and I think one of the reasons is because we have seen a degrading both at a legal level and a structural level of the media's capacity to actually organise and have good public debate. I completely recognise it's imperfect. It's always been imperfect and messy and undignified and...
But it's not acceptable.
Flawed.
This is 2019. It's unacceptable.
No, I get that, but this is my point. That I'm not saying it's acceptable. What I'm saying is that the politics, a lot of the legislation has restricted and damaged the way that the media operates and damaged our capacity to have the kinds of conversations and to deliver the kinds of outcomes you're talking about. I'm saying that the degrading of political debate has actually supported the kind of degrading that you're seeing. I'm not disagreeing. What I'm saying is that we are doing, I think we're seeing, as a consequence of the violence that I've been talking about, the violence, I mean, of the pressure on the media at all sorts of levels, degrading our political debate and leading to the kinds of inequities you're
Yeah,
talking
they're
about.
connected.
But
Yeah.
sorry. Well, do you think? Because I think there's now more access to alternative views and alternative narratives than there used to be.
There is more access to it, but at the same time, how many newspapers do we have in this market?
I don't read the
we
newspaper,
have,
but yeah.
we have access. I mean, we have access. There's a Courier Mail and the Australian in here, News Corp, and yes, you can look at the Guardian and the Brisbane Times online. But and I suspect we're looking at a fairly select group of people here. If I ask you to put up your hands and find out
Who reads the
what.
Courier Mail?
Yeah, who reads the Guardian? Yeah, I don't. But let's face it. My point is that a volume of information, and I'm not saying that we don't have access to it. What I'm saying is that the media that actually moves the political dial is more and more restricted. News Corp is the only truly national news or national media apart from the ABC. We've got News Corp. We've seen Channel 9 buy out the Fairfax papers, and so we're seeing a collapse of local journalism all over the country in a way that academics are talking about news deserts. And I think overall that's actually having a corrosive effect on public debate.
Yes. Graeme, and then we'll go back to a couple more questions on the floor.
You don't want to hear from a law academic about socioeconomics and things, but it's interesting that I can see sort of Jono and Karen are talking about, you're talking about the degradation of community life, and you're also talking about fighting back in what you're doing out at Ebden Creek. You're talking about the positive sides of community action building up from below, and then you've got sort of Peter and I, to an extent, we're coming in talking about big national issues like freedom of the press and improving politics and what law may or may not be able to do in that regard. And they're both obviously important perspectives, ground up and top down.
I guess what just really quick. What I'm really trying to hammer home, though, is that there was never a time when the press did a good job of telling the stories of the most marginalised members of society. And that's, like, when we're talking about freedom of the press, and I don't think that's up for... Yeah, you would agree.
Jono, I'd go as far as saying half the reason our people are in the position they are is because of the Australian media.
Yeah, exactly.
And I accept that. I just think it's getting worse, and as a consequence, we're seeing the results.
Hello.
I've got a question for Karen, and perhaps Jono might want to make a comment as well. You've got the state government selling off a heritage site, and it ends up in the hands of two housing developers, and also the state government takes a bit of a slice. And then you've got the Ipswich City Council in receivership for corruption inquiry, and they're the ones that gave the DA application to the housing estate. Do you think that that's the reason why people don't want to talk about the fact that Deebing Creek is a massacre site?
Definitely, Bernadette. The Deebing Creek, there's a lot of businesses involved. There's a lot of there's a politicians' hands that are signed off on these deals, irrespective of the consultation process with the claimant group. And even just that, the way the process, the legislation and the process has been rolling out, leaving one people group to make a serious decision to sell when they weren't fully informed of all what was at stake. A lot of our records by state government are withheld by us. I could trace my heritage back to castles, queens and kings in England, but here I have a personal community histories organisation that I have to apply for my great-grandparents' records. We have to, there's even a protocols in place that restrict our people even accessing those sort of things. These are the sort of things that we have well hidden and legislated. But Bernadette, yes, we've got Ipswich City Council, hasn't even got a mayor. They've got a special administrator. There's still the whole issue with the Pasali case and the Ipswich City Council coming under the spotlight with the criminal justice system is the fact that they were selling lands, making deals under the table, but yet Deebing Creek is still going ahead. That's one of the biggest issues. We exhausted every legislative requirement to stop the sale and the developments, and so we occupy them because we've exhausted all those other avenues.
Can I just really quickly flag one of the other elements in this story, which is an interesting case study, is the threat of defamation. Big companies have the ability and the resources to threaten people with defamation suits, whereas the rest of us probably don't have that avenue easily available to us. And that's always in the back of the minds of politicians and activists and other political actors. If we speak the truth too prominently and we have money, they might sue us. If we don't have money, maybe we're not worth suing. But anyway.
Hello.
Hi, my name's Margot and I'm a futurist and a change agent. And I've just read all the books of Yuval Noah Harari, who reminds us that 62 people on the planet have more wealth than the bottom 50% of people on the planet, and that with big data and AI, we're all going to be incredibly manipulated into thinking, which will then leave the world with a very small uber class and an incredibly large class of what he calls the irrelevance. We've heard, listening to you guys, which has been fascinating, and thank you, really that politics is irrelevant and that the press really serves as a means of social control. So as the irrelevance, which will include pretty much all of us, I don't know if any of you are part of the 62 that own the planet, but it's pretty much all of us. What can we do? So we can't look to politics because they're not going to do it for us. We can't look to the press because they're not going to do it for us. What can we do to create this a better world and make it an irrelevant world worth living in?
Have to have you on a panel at some point as a futurist. Karen, you got some ideas?
I got heaps of ideas, but get back to community. That was always our strength in these lands everywhere, Black Rod and Brindle. We all did it. Always got back to community, neighbours, get our eyes off those people that are on another planet, get back to our neighbours, our communities, get to know one another, our shopkeepers, small business. It's always been there. And I don't know what happened, but yeah, we sort of lost our way a bit. But getting back is so serious and important that we get back, start re-energising, and there's power in community.
Anyone else want to chip in? All right. We've got time for maybe one last question, or maybe two, depending if it's short and sharp. Sassy. Good luck.
Hello, my name's Anita. We've touched on the discussion around big corporations putting forth their views on various issues, and we've also looked at the, what was it called again, sorry, where you're encouraging the consumers to boycott, secondary boycotts. One thing that concerns me, because I have been in small business myself, why is it small businesses are crucified when they wish to take on their freedom of, well, I suppose, speech to a degree, where they will not service particular communities, particular groups within our communities? And Graeme, you might be the best person to answer that particular question, because it might be more of a legal type.
Okay, so can we concretise this? The gay cake cases, perhaps? I mean, there was a decision last year in Northern Ireland, of all places, to say that it was quite fine for the young couple who said their Christian values were they wouldn't put a gay rights message on a cake. And the court said, well, because otherwise you were forcing them to kind of speak. And as long as, I guess, you can go down the road, I don't know why the gay gentleman wanted that cake from that business necessarily, because there are other cake shops in the land. But if we are talking about... but also you've got to accept, on the other hand, that you might well be crucified. People are going to get on social media and say, don't have anything to do with that business. They don't even want to take the money of a gay gentleman. So when you get into that kind of it's my right and your versus your right, you end up sometimes a bit of a race to the bottom. So, but when I think what the Prime Minister's talking about is in terms of protecting the banks as meat in the sandwich in the mining industry and so on. That's not going to be a winner for him politically. He's going to come up soon and talk about issues of small businesses who might have been allegedly laid upon by environmental activists and so on. But I grew up in a small business background, so I can see that there are power differentials sometimes there, but we also have discrimination laws that can apply, so it is a complex area.
And I think what you touched on there is exactly right, which is that the Prime Minister will work very hard to say that this is about protecting small businesses from the big mean activists. Actually, it's about protecting big businesses from comparatively weak and disempowered activists. But the philosophical justification for going after businesses as part of a secondary boycott is partly that you're saying this issue is so important that you can't not pick a side. You can't just sit on the fence and keep building the gas chambers for the Nazis. You have to actually say, no, we are not going to work with that company or that government because they are so unethical. And I think that's important to remember here, is that we're not talking about abstract issues we're talking about literally decisions to drown billions of people in third world countries. I'm only exaggerating a little bit there. So I think I obviously feel some sympathy for when businesses get caught in the middle of this stuff, but the issues that we're talking about here are really big and important.
Okay, now that Jono's invoked a Nazi reference,
this point, end of the night.
We've got to wrap up the night. I am going to wrap it up there, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to just reference a quote recently from Barack Obama, who talked a bit about cancel culture. He made comments saying the world is messy and ambiguous, and if you are a woke person, younger people in particular he was talking about, but perhaps anyone who considers themselves awake to debate and discussion, and you decide that things are just too black and white, then it sort of cancels out the conversation. But I hope that we've had a conversation tonight that's made you think and challenged perhaps some of the bubbles, the silos that we all kind of live in. It's nice to bump up against you. Please thank our panel, Peter Greste, Jono Shree, Graeme Orr and Karen Coghill. Thank you very much.
And great facilitating by our host. Well done.